Thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the program today is someone who's going to teach us something that most of us probably don't practice as much as we believe we do, and that is the ability to actually listen. Today on the program, we're going to be talking about compassionate listening to resolve conflicts on a heart level. Wouldn't that be kind of nice to realize that not only are you being understood, but being understood from the heart? I'd like to welcome to our program today our guest, who's going to be talking about compassionate listening and how we can go about this practice to see about opening ourselves up a little bit more toward understanding others. Virginia Jones is on the Beyond 50 radio program to talk about compassionate listening. Virginia, thank you for being on the program today.
Good morning, Daniel, and thank you for having me on.
Okay, now, compassionate listening, how is this different from the listening that most people think they're actually doing when somebody's talking with them?
Well, when you listen compassionately, you have to suspend your own agenda, and you have to be completely present for the other person. But when this happens, the other person opens up and begins to trust and begins to feel that they can listen to you.
Okay, now how did you come to learn about compassionate listening?
Well, I work with survivors of abuse who are oftentimes filled with a great deal of anger and pain and rage. And one time, a few years ago, I was looking on the Internet, researching restorative justice, and I saw this quote from Compassionate Listening Project, and I thought, that sounds really interesting. So I started looking into the Compassionate Listening Project, and I took two 5-day retreats from them, and I took a year of mentoring from them to learn the skill. And I use it with my work with survivors of abuse.
Now, let's talk about the process of compassionate listening and how it actually works.
Well, what we were taught to do is you have to practice listening first, and you'll listen to someone's story, and you listen for the facts and for what their feelings were, for what wounded them, and then what are their values that are really important to them. And when you acknowledge these, when you acknowledge the facts and the feelings, they feel heard. When you acknowledge their wound and what's really important to them, they feel understood.
Okay. Now, how long have you been practicing this?
Well, I've been in the process of learning it for almost 3 years now.
Okay, 3 years. Now, when you started on this, what were some of your motivations that moved you into this direction?
Oh, gosh, that's the long question. I specifically was in the Catholic Church, and there was an abusive priest removed from my church. And the parish was torn and divided and hurt and upset. And the church had a few forums on it, and people were allowed to speak. People were very angry, and people were very hurt. And then after about 6 weeks, all talk was shut down about this Catholic priest and the whole issue of clergy abuse. And what happened is that people in the church were still grieving, and people in the church were still angry and hurt. And not at first, but it took about 5 months, about 1/3 of the parish drifted away. And I'm going, what happened here? Why? And so I started researching on the Internet, and I discovered that the leadership of this particular priest's order had known about his abuse way back to 1981. And I started reading about the story of the survivor, and I realized that the survivor had had his story denied all these years, and so he was filled with pain and anger. And I thought, I knew a lot of caring Catholics, and I thought, well, how do you bring survivors who've had their stories denied and are very hurt together with Catholics? And that was very hard to do. And I discovered the discipline of compassionate listening, and it works very well to heal wounds.
Now, let's talk about the process of how this helped, let's say, survivors, as far as you were talking about, abuse in the Catholic Church. A lot of us hear about that, and this can even extend to things outside of the church, such as sexual abuse, mental abuse. I mean, there's a whole gamut of ways that people become wounded. So what is the process of compassionate listening as you are trying to help survivors, you said, to be able to heal themselves?
Well, what we do, when we work with survivors, we have to work with them individually first. Many of them are so wounded and they haven't had enough help that they can't come before a group of Catholics. So we do mentoring in private, and I have to use the compassionate listening then because people will be so angry so angry at the Catholic Church, angry at me, even though I'm trying to help. And so I just listen to be present. And I keep on going back to what are their values, what are their wounds, and repeating that and validating them and not worrying about my agenda to prove to them that I'm caring. Just being there. And that when people reach a certain level of healing, then they can come and explore being with other survivors and other Catholics and other members of the community. And we work with not just Catholic clergy abuse survivors. We work with anyone who comes to us and tells us that they're wounded. Because from the very beginning when we started doing this, we found other people were drawn to it. And I think what we don't realize that we don't do is we don't actually listen without an agenda. Most of us have our own agenda, and we want to prove to the other person that we are right or that we are good. And that doesn't really work. And it's having to suspend your own agenda, your own perceptions, your own feelings, and just being there for the other person. And eventually with survivors, when they're able to tell their story before a supportive community that's been trained in compassionate listening, what happens is people tell us that they feel loved. And when they've been alone and isolated and uncared for, it's incredibly powerful to be before a small group of people and feel like, oh gosh, these people really understand me. They really care about me. It's incredibly uplifting and incredibly healing. And the funny thing is, it's not just uplifting for the person who's listened to. When we become a part of the healing process, we find ourselves uplifted, even if we're just the listeners.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's quite interesting because you're talking about people that, as you listen to their, I guess, situation or their experience, is that they've usually experienced a loss. It could be small or it could be large. Is this something that, I guess, kind of helps people in a relatively reasonable amount of time, or is this something that may take a while, months or maybe years? Who knows?
Well, for someone who's a survivor of abuse, it's a lifelong healing process. But this can also be used in ordinary relationships, and you might have like a little squabble or problem with someone, and it can heal it right away. So it's different. It works also in interpersonal relationships in a faster, more easygoing way.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that as we were talking before, we were talking especially about, families. You got parents and you have children, and some families, children just tend to not respond, and they tend to misbehave or do things that we just don't want them to do. And you were saying that if you actually practice compassionate listening with the children themselves, that they tend to self-discipline. Now, that's kind of interesting. How does that work?
Well, I will tell you first how I got started on doing this. I've tended to use a kind of a compassionate listening approach with my kids even before I knew the discipline, but doesn't mean I was a perfect parent. So one day, it was a little over a year ago, my daughter and I had a fight, and I told her to go to her room and sit there and think about what she had done. And so she sat there for half an hour, 45 minutes, came down, and she said to me, "Mom, you're always listening compassionately to everybody. Why don't you listen to me compassionately?"
Ah.
And so it actually works. Just this last weekend, I took my children to OMSI, to the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, and it was a last-minute schedule change. Something that we had wanted to do didn't work out. So my daughter was a little bit annoyed at this last-minute schedule change, and she got annoyed at her brother for coughing too much and taking too many things when they were playing in the stream table at OMSI. And she just started fussing and fussing and fussing, and I sat down with her and I said, I'm really feeling hurt. I brought you here to have fun, and all that was happening is that you're complaining. Right. So we're going to have a compassionate listening session right here. So I let her tell her story, and she told me that she just felt like that she was second, and she didn't matter and didn't feel cared about, and was just always having to accommodate other people. And so I just sat there and listened, and I didn't argue, and I reflected back that she was always having to accommodate her brother's needs and always having to deal with the family schedule changes, and she just wanted to be happy and having fun. And so we sat there for about 10 minutes, and then she was fine. There was no more complaints the rest of the day.
Well, now, doesn't that seem like, I guess as listeners would listen to that like it's a child like probably anybody else who wants to just kind of manipulate a situation just simply because they're not getting their own way, sort of being stubborn, if you will?
Well, we didn't leave the museum. We stayed there and continued to have fun. It's just, I think she wanted to be heard that things that had not happened the way she had wanted them to. And what she needed more than anything else was to have her feelings acknowledged. And then once she had her feelings acknowledged, she was able to settle down and be fine.
Okay, I see. Yeah, because, sometimes you see that. Sometimes you'll be in the grocery store and there's a child throwing a fit and basically getting everybody's attention, and then they begin to understand, hey, if I keep doing this, somehow they instinctively think that they're embarrassing their parents in public, is that they keep it up knowing that they're going to get their way now. And compassionate listening, is this something that might be able to curb that behavior?
Well, I think with a toddler it might be a bit different. I think what you really don't want to do is to reward that kind of behavior in a toddler.
Well, I was actually talking about somebody who might be in their 60s.
Well,
come on, you're 62 years old. What are you doing sitting there on the floor just beating on it? I don't understand this behavior anyway.
Well, sometimes you just kind of let them do it, and then what I do when my daughter throws a tantrum like that, I just let her do it, and then periodically approach her and say, are you ready to talk now? And eventually she's ready to talk. So yes, it's a pain in the neck. You don't really want to reward a behavior like that. That's true. You don't necessarily want to bend and do what they want you to do, and sometimes you just plain can't. But and that's sometimes the problem with kids, and it's also the problem with adults, is that people are not always ready to be listened to. Sometimes they need to throw that tantrum. So you just kind of do the best you can in coping with it. Don't get engaged. Don't start into the fight or the argument. Just let them do it. And then what happens is eventually they will realize sometimes, maybe not always, but oftentimes they'll realize I'm being the badly behaved. If you start yelling at them, then you're throwing a tantrum in response. So it's better to just let them throw it and periodically ask them, are you ready to talk yet?
It is kind of funny when you watch parents, too. They always take their position to being right, and you're the kid, and, I'm the one who's in control here, and they tend to just kind of shut that down and basically control through, fear or power rather than from the heart. How is this different that when you come from the heart that children actually kind of turn themselves around?
Well, most children and most adults basically throw the temper tantrums because something is hurting, something is wrong. And oftentimes I've done something that's insensitive that causes my children to throw the temper tantrum. Or the kids just basically need some time and space to, I had a friend whose children would always take the children grocery shopping right after school when she got off work, right before they got off school. So that was the most convenient time for her. And her kids always threw a temper tantrum then. And then she realized that they needed some downtime to relax after school before she took them out and went grocery shopping. And when she kind of realized that there was an issue there, that they needed something that she wasn't giving them, then everything went fine. And so in a sense, it's letting a person to have space to have their needs that are not necessarily your needs.
Now, does this really help improve relationships with people?
All I can tell you is that I have a really wonderful relationship with my children. Actually, to tell you the truth, I just went through an experience this last week where I think it has really shown that compassionate listening is a very valuable tool. And this one happened because my son was bullied at school. And what we did that was different, my son has Asperger's syndrome, I should clarify that, which is a high-functioning form of autism. So he can function in school, but his social skills are a little bit odd. He talks repetitively about certain subjects like dinosaurs and subduction zones, and he hates ketchup obsessively. And so he gets teased and taunted a lot at school. And I taught my children to do the compassionate listening a year ago after my daughter said, why don't you listen compassionately to me? And so he's used to having me resolve conflicts between him and his sister with compassionate listening sessions. And he really likes it because you feel better at the end of it. You don't feel down. You don't feel punished. You feel better. And both sides feel better. And so what happened is all year long I've been approaching the school, can we do compassionate listening? And Colin's being bullied. He wants to try to do it with his class. And the teachers were too busy because they have these tests, standardized tests, that they have to make sure the kids pass. And other people in administration who I had approached were just more nicely putting me off more than anything else. And I finally found one instructor who was willing to let me do it for 20 minutes. And the kids just came out with all these stories of bullying, and they were just opened up completely. And they wanted more. And my daughter was in the class, and before I came, she'd been telling the kids, my mom's going to come today and teach compassionate listening. And the response of all the kids was, oh, boring. But when I came, the kids were like, we want more. And I was shut down after 20 minutes. And there was like, the kids were approaching me afterwards and saying, you were better than what followed you. We wanted more. And so what happened is at school, 2 boys were teasing my son, and they were pushing him on the field after school. And they accidentally pushed him down, and he scraped his knees. And I had been so frustrated because I'd been reporting the bullying all year long, and the teachers would lecture the students, don't bully this boy. He has Asperger's syndrome or whatever. Or maybe they were just talking about bullying in general, but nothing ever happened. For about a day, things would be better, and then they'd go back. And so we just felt like we have to report this. So we reported it, and the school suspended the 2 boys. But fortunately, the mother of one of the boys was a good friend of mine, and so she called me up, and she had told her son to apologize. And I said, well, let's do a compassionate listening session. So we got together in the park and sat down, and my son's been trained in compassionate listening, and he can do it. So I let the other boy go first. And I think the other boy had been so used to not being listened to by school officials that he just opened up, and there was a warm reaction between the 2 boys. And then that mother told the mother of the other boy that things had just gone so well when I listened to the 2 boys. And so the other mother called me up this morning just before I came on the show, and she wants to have a compassionate listening session with her son and my son. And they're just feeling awful. And I just see this as the potential of helping to bring a lot of healing and maybe helping my son have more friends.
Mm-hmm. I know that's a real tough one when it comes to school, because when you tend to have somebody who's picking on another kid, and of course that kid decides to go and talk to somebody about it, well, that's tattletaling, and then pretty soon it seems like you've got more people against you, and it seems to be a real difficult position for somebody to be in.
Yes. My son was very reluctant to tell because he was afraid of retaliation. Because previously when we had
being a tattletale, as it's commonly called in school, yes.
Yes, previously when we had told, he had been retaliated against. And so I'm feeling what I had to do in the Catholic Church was just get parishioners and a supportive priest together and just start listening. And in this situation, looks like I can't get the school to do what needs to be done, so the parents are just going to have to get together and start their own movement of just listening to the kids instead of punishing them.
Okay. Now, I'm kind of curious, Virginia, when you have this compassionate listening session with the bully, okay, now let's go through that session from what you remember of how compassionate listening works, because as you said earlier in the program, it's about listening for the facts, okay? So let's go ahead and go through what sort of happened as best as you can remember so the listeners can understand exactly what compassionate listening is.
Well, what we did is the 2 boys sat in the park, and I had the other boy go first, and he told his story about what he had happened to him is that he had been punished by a teacher for scraping on a desk with his pen, and the teacher thought he was writing on the desk, and the teacher made him clean up all the desks in the class.
Wow.
And so some of the kids were in there gathering watching him because it's an age where the kids tease each other. And my son was one of those kids. And then after he was done, my son just went out and hung out on the field, I don't know, doing whatever. And then the 2 boys came up, and they were pushing him. And eventually one of them pushed him so hard that he fell down and scraped his knees. And so what I basically did is reflected back the facts that this boy had been punished, and that the children gathered around to watch him, which didn't feel very good, and that my son was one of those children. And then my son went out into the field, and the boy went out with another friend who was sympathetic to him. And they were annoyed, and my son can be annoying for other reasons because of his obsessions with the Asperger's syndrome. And so the other boy said, well, push him, and or let's get him, or something of that sort. So the other boy was pushing, and this boy didn't think he had pushed, but he was there for sure. And then my son fell down and scraped his knees. So I just sat down and I reflected those facts, and then I reflected the fact that he was really hurt, and he was in part really hurt because he hadn't really been trying to draw on the desk. He was just trying to scrape some glue off of it, and the teacher assumed that he was drawing on the desk and made him clean every single desk. And that was hurtful. And he said he actually wasn't that conscious of the kids gathering around and watching him. But that my son has been annoying, and so when he was with other kid, they just kind of got together. But he felt really hurt by the whole situation because he got suspended from school on the day of a special event, and he just felt like he was overly punished for everything.
Yeah, I can imagine. I keep remembering, for some reason, a kid I remember in school who, when you did something to him, you did it on purpose, but then he would do something and, rotten or whatever. Well, it was an accident. And then one day he met his match, of course. But, it's quite interesting to think about what goes on in school and what goes on in children, that, adults do tend to take that high road of a position of power, and they're always right, the child's always wrong. And I even remember in school that I had my own challenges, especially. It just seemed like no matter what had happened, I was always in trouble for one thing or another. Somehow my mother just seemed to have a tremendous level of compassion, because she wasn't as punishing as you would expect a mother to be for the kind of trouble that I'd get into. And, it's never an easy place for a child to be. And I'm kind of curious now, moving away from children, how well compassionate listening can work in loving relationships. Or let's say it could be even a couple that's decided we're divorced, and that can be kind of difficult right there as they start slinging and using the kids against each other, for positions of power.
Well, I wish I could tell you I had personal experience with the loving relationships, but I'm divorced. And haven't been dating. I've been focusing on my children and my work for the last 3 years, so I haven't had that chance to use it in loving relationships. I've used it in friendships, and I've used it in the more complex relationship with my ex-husband, where there's oftentimes a lot of conflict, that I've had to listen through his anger and through his annoyance. And I found that I could do it. I used to fight back, and I found that I could actually reflect back what he was feeling. Even if I disagreed with what he was saying, I could still find something that was valid. What I would describe it as, you go for the essence. And I will give you an example of that. I'm with my kids live with me, and every other weekend they go to their dad's. So a lot of the school events all come through me. And so my daughter was a member of Brownies, and she had a Brownie movie night. And that Brownie movie night fell on the weekend that my ex-husband was to have the children. And so I asked him, can you take our daughter to Brownie movie night? And he said, well, I work so hard and I don't have very much time with my kids, and you interfere with my relationship with my kids, and you don't understand my work, you don't understand my needs. Well, those accusations of me not understanding or supporting are incorrect, but it is true that he works very long hours and doesn't get very much time with his kids. So that's what I was able to do, is instead of getting into the fight about whether or not I was supportive of his work and his situation, I just sidestepped that, and I validated the essence of his concerns, that he had to work really hard, really long hours, and didn't have a lot of time with his kids. And then I was able to say, can you take our daughter to Brownie movie night? And he was not able to continue the conflict. So you just don't engage in the conflict. You don't get involved in the argument. You just go to validating the essence of what the person's concerns are, and then continue to very carefully state the same issue in a neutral way.
Mm-hmm. Now, how can someone find out how to learn and practice compassionate listening?
Well, the Compassionate Listening Project you can look for at www.compassionatelistening.org, or you can contact me at compassion500@gmail.com.
Well, very good.
I'm sorry, compassion500@gmail.com.
Compassion500@gmail.com. Okay, very good. And, and this isn't really a way that somebody's trying to sit in a position where they can change. It's actually, it's where you actually listen to someone with your heart, and so you become more understanding of what their hurts are, and then that way that actually heals the relationship between two people.
Yes, and when you do it, they're actually oftentimes more able to listen to you and open up to you, and then you get reconciliation and healing in the relationship.
So it's almost as though Stephen Covey might have been right in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People: seek to understand and then be understood.
Yes.
Oh, very good. Well, it's really interesting to be able to have the kind of necessary tools when it comes to being able to have good, healthy relationships with others just through compassionate listening alone. And Virginia Jones, I'd like to thank you for joining us on the program and talking about this.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
Okay, Virginia, go ahead and give out that website one more time.
Okay, I gave you the Compassionate Listening Project. I can give you my own website, which is www.compassionategathering.org.
Well, very good. Well, Virginia Jones, again, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Hopefully I was a compassionate listener myself.
You did an excellent job of listening to me compassionately. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So there you go, folks. If you're out there and you're trying to figure out how to make relationships more solid, even just feeling better, about yourself as you're around other people, compassionate listening is certainly that tool that can help you do that. We also want to encourage you to visit our website at www.beyond50radio.com and find out more about what we're up to, and also sign up for a free weekly e-newsletter. I want to thank Virginia Jones for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Also, you, the listeners, for tuning in. Also want to send out a special thanks to one of our sponsors that make this program possible. That is ZRT Laboratory. Are you suffering from hot flashes, foggy thinking, sudden weight gain, low libido, mood swings, and other effects of aging? ZRT Laboratory, the forerunner in hormone testing, is your first step toward ending troublesome symptoms. Just simply visit ZRT Lab online at zrtlab.com to find out how their home collection kits can help detect and correct hidden hormone imbalances. Let testing be your guide to symptom relief and life-changing solutions that begin with you. And physician's guidance is recommended. I'm Daniel Davis. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Again, thank you for joining us today, and remember, live your day past halfway.